I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Oh, no, I was,
Yeah, it was,
hey, do you know, we can, here, I'll move over. Do you know pumpkin?
Right. You mean like once a year versus like biannual? Is that what you mean? Yeah, got it. You know what How interesting. We have a cross-species audience. Yeah, he's very good at talks. Yeah, he can last a 3-hour class. Flat on my lap. He's very good. He just lies to the life flat on my lap.
And then I'll process it right away, just to send you, like a picture is fine, just, and then, so it's streamed on if there are any questions, do you want to just like, text to us So if there's anything on the two audios, I'll send you. Just like 1 minute. Oh, no.
well, then that's not true, I guess that's not.
I'm going to take one second to...
Sure.
Oh. What? Don't look at that. Really? Okay.
All right, it's my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Adele Goldberg for this Simon Center talk. So Adele is one of the most trailblazing and innovative and creative and just overall fun researchers that you'll find in our field. And I'll just give you the short list of her background and accomplishments to make sure this doesn't take too long as an introduction, because it could. So she did her undergraduate work in mathematics and philosophy at UPenn, and then graduated from Berkeley Linguistics with a Ph.D. in linguistics, but also was in the Logic and Methodology of Science program. And she has spent time as faculty at the University of California, San Diego, in the same department that I was in before coming here, preceding me. She spent time at UIUC, and now she's a professor of psychology at Princeton University. And she does pioneering work in just so many areas, combining methodologies, insights, theories. She is, I think it's safe to say, the leading proponent of the construction grammar theory of linguistic knowledge. And construction grammar is a theory that draws on both the mathematical descriptions of language structure with insights from psychology and learning theory and also computation. And I think you see these different strands integrated in wonderful ways in her work. And she's trailblazed in ways not just including the theory of language. She has many highly influential and well-known books on the structure of language, but also branching out into how we learn, how we generalize using experimental methods, using computational methods. Her honors and awards include a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, fellowship of the Linguistic Society of America, the Fillmore Professorship at the Linguistic Society of America, which is a very distinguished position, which is given only once every 2 years at the Linguistic Society of America Summer Institute. And she's also actually the chair of the Cognitive Science Society, so her influence has extended very clearly out of linguistics and beyond. So I didn't know until very recently that her interests and research have extended even to the domain so dear to the Simon Center of autism, in particular autism and language, and that's what she's going to be talking about today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Adele Goldberg for a talk on generalizations in autism and language.
Thank you, Roger. That was super nice, and also a little embarrassing because, especially because I'm just taking my first baby steps into the field of autism. So I hope you'll bear with me. Before I start, I'm going to just say a few words, and I'll explain later a little more about it. But I'm really delighted to be visiting the Simons Foundation, and it was really an honor to meet some of my heroes today and get to talk to some of you. I want to thank Alexandra for organizing and Roger for hosting me. It's great to be in Massachusetts. I'm so happy to see friends from MIT and Harvard and BU and Tufts. And I'm looking forward to visiting the harbor and the Globe. I'm a Red Sox and Bruins fan, and I'm looking forward to running the marathon. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is briefly the role of categorization in autism, and then I'll briefly again talk about categorization in language on the perspective of language that I adopt. And then I'll explain a couple of recent experiments relating autism and language. And then I'll briefly talk about future directions, scaling up and interventions. Okay, and those will be at the top, so you can figure out how long you'll have to wait here. Okay, so there's a saying in the autistic community, which is if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And we know it's a very heterogeneous, I don't know what to call it. It's not necessarily a disability, it's a syndrome, and we know it's a spectrum. Many things have been associated with it, cognition, social cognition in particular, auditory processing, motor functions. I stole this idea from Helen Tager-Flussberg. We were at a meeting together last weekend. But because I'm a linguist without apology, I'm going to focus on language because language is a huge concern among autistic children and their families. A full 25%, whether they're exposed to auditory language or sign language, don't acquire or acquire minimally verbal language. Okay, so in the domain of cognition, and that's the domain I'm going to focus on, there have been various people who've suggested that executive function plays a role, and it does seem to. Prediction, your own Professor Sinha has suggested this is a critical piece of the puzzle. And what I'm going to focus on is a piece of autism, which is categorization. And I'm going to argue that it may, and it seems to have important implications for language in this population. So I'm going to try to refer to autistic individuals as autistic people or autistic individuals. This is based on a survey we did where we just asked our adult population what terminology they preferred. And they were very accepting of all of the terms, actually, but their favorite was autistic first, so that's what I'll try to use. Okay, so in the domain of categorization, intriguingly, it's been found in several studies that autistic people are often more veridical in their memories. So if asked, are these the same or different? Well, in this case, neurotypicals too will say they're different because they clearly are different. In this case, neurotypicals might say, for example, that they're the same, but they're actually not the same, and autistic people would be more likely to notice that. This ability to discriminate very subtle differences has been found not only in vision, but also in low-level auditory processing. Okay, these two actually are the same. So another interesting example is that if asked, is the square now in orange, is it the same or different than the previous dot array? Autistic individuals tend to be better at this, or matched with neurotypical controls. But when asked which is more similar to the previous dot pattern, they do less well than neurotypicals. So they seem to have they have no trouble recognizing differences, but they are less strong at similarity judgments. Another example of that is that when provided with examples of cave ghosts, and this is a cave ghost, and examples of non-cave ghosts and trained on those differences, and then asked to decide whether new examples were cave ghosts or not, the autistic children were less likely to base their judgments on the average of the examples that they had witnessed. So they're less likely to form the prototype example of this. Another example is that if neurotypical children are taught a new word like DAX, and they're given an example, this is a DAX, and then they're asked, show me the DAX. Neurotypical children, by the time they're 2, will rely on shape to make that choice, because the word is presented as a noun. Nouns tend to be organized by shape, and by the time neurotypical kids are 2 years old, they pick up on that correlation in the input, and they also judge on shape. Whereas autistic children are uneven in that and often don't prioritize shape in this kind of context until they're 4 years old or older. Okay, so now I finally get to, so did I say, now I get to admit I'm not actually going to the marathon, and I'm not even a Bruins or whatever fan, but did I say Boston when I was saying that weird intro? How many people think I did say Boston? Okay. So this isn't the classical way of presenting it, but neurotypicals are more likely to generalize over the words that they hear and sort of fill in the blanks. And so if given usually a list of words, but I knew you would be familiar with that, neurotypicals tend to have this false memory for the word that generated the examples. Whereas autistic individuals are less likely to be prone to these kinds of false memories in that case. So one way to think about it is that their memories are more discrete. They're not categorizing or clumping all of those words together to form a generalization. Instead, they're keeping them separate. They're more accurate on that. Okay, so this idea has been around, and it's certainly not new to me. But what interests me about it is that it really has clear implications given the approach to language that I'm persuaded by. So the way I understand language is, we call it a usage-based constructionist approach. Basically, the idea is that we're flexibly categorizing the language that we hear into patterns on the basis of form and function. That is, we're learning categories, and I'll give you some examples. So those pairings of form and function I refer to as constructions, and constructions can be both words, because they're learned form, function pairings, and grammatical patterns. So if I say, it's blank of you to be here, what word comes to mind? Nice, right. Okay, so it turns out that this is an example of what we've called the English gossip construction. This is for you, Rebecca. You're working on this kind of topic. So the construction is really it's devoted to gossip. It's devoted to describing somebody's judgment about someone else's action. So many adjectives, most adjectives can occur in this construction. Nice is the most frequent one that does occur in the construction, so this is just a word cloud based on relative frequencies. What's interesting, though, is that we generalize on the basis of the examples we've heard. So nice is the most common word used, but it's often used sarcastically, and you can put very negative adjectives in this too. But notice that whatever adjectives you put in it, you wouldn't say, it's odd to say, it's tall of you to reach the top shelf, right? Because that's not a gossipy, that's not an evaluative adjective. You can't gossip about that. You also wouldn't say, it's good of the water to get hot, because that of phrase has to be an animate, responsible human or sentient being. And notice too that if you say, it's big of him to admit the screw up, or it was rich of them to hide for over a year, we don't interpret big or rich to mean what they usually mean. We have to interpret them in a way that's consistent with the meaning of the construction. So we give them this evaluative interpretation where big means generous and rich means ironic. Okay. So this is true that these constructions have an interpretation even when you don't have a verb or a particular word in the construction that lends it that meaning. So if I ask you what moop means in she mooped him something, what do you think it means? Right, so again, this is a word cloud of the top 20 instances. Give accounts for about 50% of the tokens of the construction, and it turns out that when you use this construction in English, it has the meaning of transfer. So you wouldn't say she gave that place something, because it has to be transfer between one person and another person. And similarly, if you say she took him something or she got him something, take usually means to take for yourself. But in this construction, she took him something, it has the interpretation of giving. Get can mean all kinds of things, like I got something. Again, it can mean I acquired it myself. But if I got him something, it has to mean I intend to give him that thing. And if you think about the difference in meaning between these two sentences, so the first one, she baked him something, has that same form that is so common with give. So she baked him something, she mooped him something. It doesn't have the same interpretation as Sam baked something for him. And it takes a minute to think about what the difference is, because I know at first blush they do seem to mean the same things. But notice that you wouldn't use the double object construction, she baked him something, if Sam baked something because he was sick. So imagine that they're both bakers and Sam was supposed to make it, he was supposed to make it and Sam does it instead of him. You could say Sam baked something for him, but you wouldn't say Sam baked him something. You also wouldn't say Sam baked him something if she intends to throw the cake at him, right? But you could say the second sentence in that case, Sam baked something for him. Okay. Another example is she blanked her way into the room, and this construction is most commonly used with make. And the verb make, when you think about it, means to create. And in fact, the construction means that you're creating a path and moving through it. And that's why you get this interpretation that there's some kind of difficulty involved. So notice that it would be odd to say she walked her way into the room, but she walked her way down the ski slope is much improved, right? Because in that case, it's hard. Okay. And language is full of these cases. So these aren't rare. You get these all the time. So he drove her, okay, good, crazy. And crazy is the most common. But we can say he drove her nuts or mad or bonkers. And then we know we can extend it to new cases like he drove her mashugana, if you know what mashugana means, which means crazy. And the clustering allows us to be creative with language, so it allows us to use new cases appropriately. So pants are single things. You can pick them up with 2 fingers, but yet we use the plural agreement in the verb, and it turns out we do that for all kinds of bottom bipartite legwear. So we don't have to know what these things are called to know that we're going to use it with a plural verb. Okay. So this approach to language that many people have been proposing is that you're really learning from the statistics in the input and generalizing over it to learn those functions. And that's what allows you to use it in new cases. The idea of generalization extends straightforwardly to word meaning. So if I ask you what baby means, you're all going to think of the central case first. But we know you can use it in all of these other ways, where the baby in the family doesn't have to be young. To baby someone means to treat them as if they were a baby, and so on. Okay, so we've extended the category baby in all these conventional ways. It's true with the word break too. So these are prototypical instances of break represented there, but when we also use break and take a break or give me a break, and nothing's breaking there. Okay, and just one more example is tea, where in these 2 cases we hardly even think of them as different senses, but notice that they're different. There's no tea bag in the first drink, and this is not something you can drink. And then if you look a little further, like British English, you can use in ways I don't quite understand, so I hope these are right. You can use tea to mean like tea sandwiches or tea to mean dinner. And spill tea is still another use to mean like to gossip, actually. All right. So it turns out that these, in the case of word meanings, and that's what I'll focus on for the next part of the talk, in the case of word meanings, it's very typical for words to have different but related meanings, and this is what we refer to as polysemy. The work that I'm going to be talking about, Sammy Floyd here had a huge hand in. She's the first author on the first study I'll tell you about. So polysemy is super common. Depends how you count, but somewhere between 40 and 80% of words have multiple conventional meanings that are related. Homonymy, that is 2 meanings that are unrelated, is much more rare. So in English, only 4% of words have ambiguous meanings, unrelated meanings. In fact, it was hard to come up with them. So at first I thought duck and to duck, and then I saw that the picture of to duck is actually a person going like this, like squatting like a duck, and I thought, oh, maybe, and then in fact, historically, those 2 meanings are related. These 2 meanings are not historically related. Okay, but so we can ask, why is it that languages work this way? Why do forms tend to have a category of meanings? And the reason I think is clear. It's because we're encountering new contexts. We're encountering new people, new situations, and we have our fixed inventory of words and constructions. We need to extend them in new contexts, so that's what we do. So our word for spoon, these are all spoons, even though they share the same shape. And then if you see chocolate spoons, or this, feather-like spoon, you're going to call it a spoon because you don't have a better word for it. And you're going to include it in the category, which will slightly extend your category. Or these are dogs, and I don't know what you would call these, but we don't have a better word for them, so we're likely to call them dog, and they get put in the category too. So this is why we get these extended categories. So what I've shown you so far is that there are stricter categories, that autistic individuals have stricter categories, and that language depends on flexible generalizations. So now let's look at autism and language. And we know that autistic individuals tend to be very delayed in their onset of speech. It's usually why they get taken to the pediatrician. They tend to repeat things a lot. There's echolalia, depending on the severity of symptoms. I showed you the delayed shape bias that they have. We know they also have challenges interpreting metaphors. And insofar as language is based on categorization, we're predicting that that is going to have widespread and enduring effects on their language. So again, most common words, especially common words, convey multiple related meanings. And we know from Sammy's work that neurotypical children and adults find it easier to learn polysemy, related meanings, than homonymy. And I'll show you an example of this. But we're going to ask in this study, also by Sammy, what about autistic children? Okay, so Sammy did this very clever study where she tested 60 neurotypical children and 40 autistic children. She taught them 8 novel words. 4 of them had related meanings. So here's an example of a set of novel meanings that are related to one another. It's not obvious that they're related, but if you look at the central figure, it shares something with the figure to the right and something else with the figure to the left. And that's the way natural categories work. They don't have strict definitions, but there's a category resemblance. So this is an example of polysemy, and other examples were homonymous. That is, the images were not related in any obvious way. Okay. So of course, yes, anything is related to anything else. None of these are elephants, but they're a lot less related than the polysemy cases. Okay, so again, she taught them 4 polysemous words and 4 homonymous words. And the exposure to learn these words was just images with the names. So this is a kaisi, this is a nona, this is a kaisi, this is a nona, so on. And then the task was which ones are kaisis, and they had to pick out the images that went together with that label. Okay, so homonymy is going to be in gray, and the polysemy is going to be in orange. Okay, and we have the autistic children on the left and neurotypical children on the right. So right after exposure, you can see what I mentioned before, that neurotypical children find it easier to learn related meanings than unrelated meanings. It's easier to learn baby corn than elephant corn. Okay. The autistic children were matched on their above chance ability to recognize the homonymy, the unrelated meanings. So what we're interested in is, did they take advantage of the relationships among meanings? And they did not. And then Sammy tested them after a week delay, and the neurotypical children still remembered those words that had different but related meanings. And the neurotypical children barely did. Okay, so what we see there is that the autistic children didn't show the advantage for related meanings. So now we might ask, is it just a delay? They didn't do that well on the homonymous meaning, so maybe they'll just get better. So in the next study, we're going to test adults. We might also ask, were the novel shapes overwhelming or were the novel words overwhelming? It's hard to learn 8 novel words with 3 meanings apiece, after all. So now we're going to use familiar words. And then we also might ask, because these were all visual images that they didn't have functions, they only had shapes. So we might ask, is it due to a reduced attention to shape? So in this study, we're going to test other shapes. Okay. So in this study, and this is being led by Nicole Cuneo, we're testing 80 autistic adults and 80 neurotypical adults. And there are 2 tasks. One is a meaning extension task, and now we have a label learning control task. So I'll explain each one. But importantly, the meaning extension task requires this flexible generalization that I'm arguing is important for language. And the label learning control task does not require generalization. The order of tasks was counterbalanced across participants. And we're hypothesizing that the autistic adults will have more difficulty on the meaning extension than on the label learning, because it's only the meaning extension that requires generalization. So first, we checked all participants whether they knew the familiar words that we were going to be using. These are the familiar words, and the task was a alternative forced choice task, which is the CAP. Both groups did super well on this, so they did know the meanings of the words. Here's the key trials that we were interested in. We asked participants, which is the knife? Now, we're giving them only 4 alternatives, and I know that you would normally call this a scissors, but the question is, which is closest to a knife? And another example is, which is the cap? Now, we'd normally call this a lid, but if I give you a 4 alternative forced choice task, you're very likely to pick this as the cap. And we do this in natural conversation. There are many times we can't remember the perfect word, so we use a good enough word instead. So here are the target words. They were inspired by actual polysemy in other languages. Okay, so that's the flexible meaning task, the meaning extension task, and now I'll explain the label learning control task. So here we familiarized all the participants with a bunch of novel objects, and 8 of the novel objects were labeled with nonsense names. So this is a bosa, this is a lochi, and so on. And then we simply asked people, which is the bosa? And we wanted to know how many they'd get, how well they do on this 4 alternative forced choice. So notice it's the same kind of task. It's also attaching a label to a new object. Okay. So as predicted, we see that the neurotypicals outperform the autistic adults on the flexible meaning extension task. So that's what we were predicting. They do have trouble with the meaning extension task. Notice, though, they're far above chance. So chance is 25%. They're all above 50%. I should say the dots are participants. And 29% of the autistic adults are at ceiling on this task. So it's not that there's no variation. But 75% of the neurotypicals were at ceiling on this task, and there's a significant difference. Well, maybe they just performed worse overall, but it turns out that the autistic individuals perform better on the label learning task than the neurotypical population. And we got the significant interaction that we predicted, and the pairwise comparisons are also significant. So let me just say a few words about that. So why is the label learning task interesting? Well, it shows that the autistic adults were actually more skilled at recognizing label item matches. So it wasn't that raw word learning was particularly hard. And they were also attentive and motivated in this task. But the flexible extension task, we also checked, and it was not predicted by familiarity with Spanish. So you might have noticed 6 of our 14 items were inspired by Spanish because Sammy came up with them. And but the autistic adults happened to be slightly more familiar with Spanish than the neurotypicals. That did not predict performance. Neither did education level, so they were pretty closely matched. We looked for people who did not have a college degree, and but when we put years of education in, that also did not predict the results. And finally, we tried to analyze the errors that the autistic individuals made. Oh, I should have said, they're way above chance, which shows that they understood the task, right? They're all way above chance. So they did understand the task. So what were they making errors on? Well, we normed the target items by asking people to label them, because we thought if executive function is an issue, maybe the fact that if everyone agrees that this is a lid and not a cap, that might interfere with their ability to call it a cap. That would be predicted by the codability is the term for that. Like, do people agree on the same label? So we calculated the entropy of how people labeled these images out of context, and that did not predict the errors. And then we also asked people to rate how similar in shape the target labels were to the conventional meanings, and that also did not predict the errors. The errors were pretty across the board for autistic individuals. Okay, so we're now going to scale up from words to grammatical constructions, and I'm just going to present a pilot study of this. But we're interested in how people learn bits of language or novel constructions. So in this study, we used a novel non-English word order and a novel abstract meaning. So here, I'll give you an example.
The doctor, the construction worker, vacos.
Okay, so there were 16 clips with these nonsense verbs and non-English word order, 5 different verbs. All of them involved the doctor approaching the construction worker in some kind of manner.
The doctor, the
Okay. So here's what the clips look like. And then at test, we included some of the items that they had seen before during the exposure phase, and also some new items. So here's an example of a new item.
Angel, the judge Guidos.
Okay. So this is just the pilot data. But when there's no generalization required, so these are familiar cases, the neurotypicals do better than our group of autistic individuals. That's why it's a pilot study. We want to get a better match here. And you do see a lot of variation. But both groups are above chance on the cases that they witnessed. What's really striking to us, and this is what we want to look at more carefully, is in the extensions to new cases, the neurotypicals on average were still above chance. But you can see that the autistic group was really at chance, no different. Okay. So, and there was a significant interaction here, although, again, it's just a pilot, meaning that the autistic people were worse on the instances that needed generalization than they were on the cases that didn't need the generalization. Okay, so I'm gonna close with an idea about our intervention, but I just want to summarize where we are. So we know that autistic individuals find non-linguistic generalizations more challenging, and I would also claim that we know that linguistic knowledge involves flexible generalizations and categorization. And we also know for sure that autistic individuals find language more challenging than neurotypicals do. So what we've attempted to look at here is whether hypothesis 3 is partially due to 1 and 2, whether their trouble with language is partially due to their categorization issues. And what we've seen, again, is just baby steps in this direction. We're hoping to do a lot more. But what we've seen is that learning polysemy, related word meanings, is as hard as learning homonymy for autistic individuals, at least that we tested. And flexibly extending familiar meanings seems to be harder for autistic individuals than neurotypicals. Okay, and then the new work that I alluded to indicates that generalizations in grammatical patterns are similar. Okay, and now I'm going to tell you about the intervention that we don't have data on, but I'm excited about testing it. So it's not that autistic individuals can't see similarity. If you direct their attention to it, they can see that two things are related to one another. So we want to guide their attention in a way that might be useful. So remember that neurotypical toddlers prioritize shape by the time that they're 2 years old. Okay. So it turns out that there was a brilliant study by Linda Smith at Indiana where she taught neurotypical children to prioritize shape just from generalizing experience on 4 novel words. And she taught these neurotypical kids when they were 17 months old, so super young. So she just taught them these 4 novel words. In the lab, she brought them in for 20 minutes a week. This is a wub. Here's another wub. That's not a wub. Here's a wub. Okay, again and again for 8 weeks. And then after that, these kids that should not show the shape bias, they were only 19 months old, did show the shape. They had learned it from that correlation and experience. So when asked, this is a DAX, show me another DAX, they picked the one with the same shape. And what was especially interesting about the study was that here's the figure of the number of object names, so the number of nouns that the kids who got that exposure had learned between the pretest at 17 months and 19 months, so 3 months after that exposure started. They learned more nouns in the real world after learning the shape bias. So the shape bias is useful for learning names for common objects, and they didn't see that effect in other types of words because the shape bias is not going to be helpful for learning verbs or adjectives or anything else. So what we want to do is we want to do it a little more easily. Instead of bringing in 80 kids to the lab for 8 weeks, which we don't really have the scale to do, we're going to try to induce the shape bias in a similar way to what Linda Smith had done. So with using picture books. So we're going to say, where's the last Zibit? Can you find it? After we've shown them what a Zibit is, shown them examples that aren't right, shown them examples that are right. And they'll, so, you know, with the idea inspired exactly by the Smith et al. Study. When we're not going to try to do this in 17-month-old autistic kids, but we think that if 17-month neurotypical kids can do this, that there should be at least a group of 3 to 4-year-old autistic children who should be able to do this. And we'll test their noun vocabulary and their general vocabulary before and after. Okay, so I hope to give you some results on that, but that's still in the works. So I want to thank my wonderful lab, especially Sammy, who's here, and also thanks to Alexandra and Roger, and thank you very much for coming.
Questions?
Yes.
Technical maybe question. In adult experiments, you mentioned that the autistic adults have big diversity in their performance in the first results. Is this diversity also predictive of their performance in the second experiments?
So there wasn't enough variation to see any correlation there. So, because everybody, you know, the performance on the task, on the flexible meaning extension averaged like 83%. So we didn't even look for that, actually. Yeah.
For autistic adults?
That was for the autistic adults. The neurotypicals are at like 96%. Right. Yes.
So I'm just trying to make sense of all of this. So basically we have this increased precision that's happening in autistic individuals, yet they're more prone to being able to note dissimilarity between objects. Have you tried in your studies to ask the question of dissimilarity, so rewording it, so doing the counterfactual rather than the factual, like, is this object rather than is this not this object, or does this not belong to this category? So instead of in the 4-choice alternative task being like, pick the one that isn't, pick the one that is the thing, pick the ones that are not the thing. Does that make sense?
Oh, well,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Pick the,
Because they have this increased signal precision, right? But they're just, the reporting error is that there's this
Right, so-
this difference between reporting similarity versus dissimilarity. Yeah.
that's interesting. So if I said, yeah, if we ask them, show me which ones are not a cap.
Right. Right.
Yeah, my guess is they would say all of them, but it's a good thing to test.
Yeah,
You're
so
right.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just
Yeah,
finding something.
yeah, yeah. But that's what we would predict, that they would say, they would pick all of them.
They would
None of
pick
those
all
are
of them.
caps.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's a fair question.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. Yeah, we should test it. Yes?
So if you were to think about the mechanisms underlying this difficulty in generalization, do you think there is one common source to difficulties in generalization, say, in the purely visual domain or in the linguistic domain, possibly in the auditory domain? Or would you expect to find diversity across those domains?
You know, that's a great question. I'm super interested in that. I would hesitate to venture a guess. So people find differences across domains, like with statistical learning, for example, so I really don't know. Yeah. Do you have an idea? Let me ask you. What do you think?
So I would venture there would be some commonality, that they're all tapping into some common memory mechanisms, and there's say a difficulty in integrating, as we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
Difficulty in integrating instances across different exposures.
So I would love to see that. I mean, that would make it even more exciting, right? I'm trying to stay in my lane of language here, but yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I have two things. A small thing is actually for the lid question, I thought it was the umbrella because I was thinking cap as in.
Oh, great. Okay. Fair. Yep.
So, and then my other one, which is a real question maybe, which is for intervention, you mentioned like age group 3 to 4. Is that like just any autistic kid, or like ones who are verbal, and like how are you like gauging that? And would the goal of the intervention be have them learn more nouns and become like increase their lexicon, or okay.
Yeah, that would be the idea. So the reason we're choosing 3 and 4 is that we think that they might have enough language, some of them, to be able to listen to the storybooks, to pay attention, to understand the instructions in the task. If they don't, then we can't test them. So they're going to have to be at least medium, have some verbal ability. Otherwise we won't be able to test them. Then we're going to randomly assign them to a control and a non-control. So you're right, subset of the population we can test. But yeah, the idea would be to jumpstart their learning of nouns. Nouns are a bigger proportion of everyone's vocabulary, so if we can help them get off the ground with that, we find it useful. But what you say about the umbrella is actually right. We in each of the 4 there is a foil which was separately judged by neurotypicals to be a less good example than the target, but we didn't want to make it too easy. So we did have something that had some abstract relationship to the target word. Yeah, and then we actually did a norm study with autistic people afterwards, and found that this was just a 2 alternative force choice between, say, the cap and the umbrella, and the autistic people. Yeah, they showed lower agreement on that too. So I'm not saying that they didn't have any reason to judge, but they're not judging on the same basis as most of the neurotypicals are. Yeah. Yes?
I'm kind of trying to reconcile this with my impression that it's easier for autistic people to like acquire sign languages. But they, like in my impression, like sign languages are only more polysemous or like analogous. So I'm trying to reconcile that. Do you have any comments?
So I'm gonna let Helen Tager-Flusberg. Oh, okay, yes. So we have a star guest in the audience, Helen Tager-Flusberg. She was asking about sign language and whether, so I'll give my steps. Sign language is not actually easier to learn. You get about 25% minimally verbal signers too. So is that your? Yeah. Okay, good. So, right. So it's not easier to learn for autistic kids, unfortunately. Yeah. Yes.
I know you said there's not enough variation in your learning task to see the individual differences, right. But if you're guessing the mechanisms underlying the variabilities in vocabulary in autistic populations, do you think it's more likely for the mechanisms for learning direct association or generalization that contribute more to individual differences? So in another word, do you feel like meaning extension is more associated with autistic traits rather than?
So trouble with extending meaning.
Yeah.
And the fact that the neurotypical group did better than, sorry, the autistic group did better than the neurotypical group on the simple label learning task, I think might be special to the fact that this is a low needs group, right? And yeah, so I'm interested in that. Is that a way of compensating, right? If you're not forming the generalization, which would be easier to recall, because there's, you've strengthened your representations through repetition and related instances, how might you compensate if you become verbal? And all of our participants were verbal. Having that excellent recall memory, I think, might be a way to compensate. Yeah, so I would not predict that all autistic people would do better on the label learning task. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some evidence of differences in looking patterns in autistic individuals, so like honing in on certain focal features or distinct features of an item. And I'm wondering if you think that might relate to like the lack of shape bias, not taking the Gestalt into account, and whether that might be something to integrate, like teaching, looking at this Gestalt image within the intervention.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. So our interest is beyond shape, but you're right that insofar as shape is relevant, that might have something to do with it. The overall circumference may not be something they attend to, right? No, that's right. But when I think about language, I think about all those cases that I mentioned, the different kinds of generalizations that you need. And shape is just low-hanging fruit because we know it can be done really easily with neurotypical kids. But, eventually we'd like to say, okay, you have trouble with metaphors. Let's explain the underlying systematicity in this metaphor. Now does that make it easier to understand metaphorical language?
But it might relate to the enhanced vocabulary too. So if people are really honing in on a certain feature, for this particular group of autistic individuals, maybe that's helping them to remember these words.
Yeah.
Maybe.
No, that's right. Yeah. Helen?
So I think you do have to keep in mind that vocabulary, acquiring vocabulary for verbal people without cognitive impairment, that is never a problem, okay? But of course, the issue is that the way we test vocabulary is not in the way that you were constructing. We don't look for extensions beyond the meaning of
Right.
the term.
Right.
And you're usually testing it with rather prototypical examples. And even within categories, I don't think that there's that much evidence for people like the ones in your study having trouble with generalization within the category. So they'll recognize all different types of cars, or all different types, not all, but most types of dogs. Where things may be different is on the periphery, or when you're trying to, as you were doing, push them beyond the boundary of the category. And what we do is we flexibly extend, and I love that term. And so it's not generalization within so much as beyond that you've really hit on here.
So I take your point, and you're absolutely right. These are verbal adults that were using the internet, and so we wanted to push them. We knew that they would know that. Well, we tested, and they did know the simple prototypical meanings. But I'm left wondering whether some of the trouble getting off the ground for the 25% of kids who are minimally verbal might have to do with this. Do you think? I have no idea. But if they know this is a spoon, but they don't know this is a spoon.
Oh, that problem is so much deeper than that. There was lovely work by Sue Carey and her former student, whose name I'm blocking right now. They'll learn the picture that if they want a spoon for something, that they can pick the spoon, the picture of the spoon, but they don't actually see the relationship between the picture of the spoon and a real spoon. So the word extension, it just doesn't. So for them, it's completely associative. These are minimally verbal kids. So it's so much beyond what you're talking about here, which is very interesting though, to look at where the boundaries of the intact language might be. That's what you're really looking at here.
But think about the polysemy with the nonsense words versus the homonymy. So in that case, the canonical thing to do would be to remember what you learned, but neurotypical kids get an advantage from seeing implicitly that relatedness.
Yes.
And the autistic kids didn't seem to get that advantage, which would make it a harder task for them. And so that's where we're coming in thinking for some population that can learn words but doesn't know how to extend, something that should be within a category, right? But for them it's a whole new sense. Is the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think that these categories of meaning, like the category of spoon is a category, and the category of baby is a category. They're different. In one case, it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, those are different meanings. And for spoon, we think, oh yeah, it's all the same. But it's not all the same, right? There are differences. And what you say about the picture image is interesting. And it makes me think that maybe, once they know one real life spoon, they also have trouble extending it to a different real life spoon.
I'm talking about the minimum level with significant intellectual disability.
Right.
But I think what I find so attractive about what you're talking about here is that none of these aspects of language are what we capture when we do any
Regular
kind of
vocabulary test.
testing of things.
Yeah.
So you never pick that up in an assessment, but it's clearly something that's there, even for people who are acing the tests. So it's the tests that don't capture
that's interesting. Right.
the richness of language that is being missed by the autism.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, that's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, I'll deal with some lack of knowledge on lots of these things, and I don't work on language at all, but certainly on the vision space, I first want to point out that even in this category of spoon there's no clear boundaries at any level of there's always going to be
Right, I agree.
breakdown points. So,
Yeah.
and I know you guys are talking, we were saying, oh, it's obvious in the category. Even that's not true. So that means generalization is always, there's never a right answer to almost any generalization. You can sometimes phrase it when there's a ground truth in the physics of the world, but other than that,
Well, there's agreement among people. That's what I would treat
well,
as a
okay,
ground
so
truth.
maybe that is your definition of the right answer, but then agreement
Yeah.
among which people, I don't know. So again, there's a frame of
Yeah.
reference somewhere.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask maybe this is a more fundamental thing. When you go to the things at the beginning about the visual cases of, oh, this is the same and this is different.
Yeah.
Like, maybe this is known, and is the first thing I think of as doing visual psychophysics is first you just want to check, is this just a bias is it a sensitivity difference or is it a bias? In other words, everything's different. Anytime you ask me, it's different, right? But of course, if you push me, and this relates to the question of different ways to phrase the question.
Right.
Like,
Right.
if you encourage me, if it's the same and you get it wrong, you're not, there's techniques you can use to encourage that so-called, psychophysical, exploring that bias boundary, separating sensitivity from bias. Is that known that isn't just a bias in the visual cases, or is that not known?
Well, I think it is thought of as a bias toward attending locally, is the way it's described, but
a bias towards just saying same in that case. I mean, different.
Oh, well.
I'm sorry, that's it, right? I tend to say different. Anytime you ask me, it's always different.
well,
And that's
right,
we call
but
that lack of generalization, or maybe those are the same thing.
well, if it was just a task demand, then that would not be interesting. You're absolutely right. But it's the fact that it's been replicated in different ways, but it's been replicated in these other tasks too. And for instance, I found the ghost caves interesting because there it was based on do they form the prototype, and so they generated the variables, the variety of cases based on the prototype, but they didn't show the prototype. Neurotypicals will, these studies, I don't have to explain it to you. But the autistic kids were less likely to accept the prototype as an example of the category. So it's true, though, there hasn't been as much work on the category issue in autistic people, but I haven't seen anybody arguing that it's not relevant. I've only seen people argue that it is relevant. So, yeah. I don't know. Yes?
So I have a question about, so you mentioned this interesting differences between these two populations, and it seems from your talk that it's more like a cognitive differences. Basically, the peoples represent things in different ways. But I wonder whether there's a more deeper social aspect there, right? The reason why we need to flexibly extend words is because we're talking to different people, they may have different views. And that's why some people might say this is a chair, and others may say this is a table, or something like that. And so I wonder whether, first, how do you think this relationship to the social aspects? And second, do you think this intervention that you mentioned could improve or could maybe give some hints to improve the social interaction as well? By increasing the sensitivity to generalization, they could also
Right.
improve the general social interaction.
Well, we tried to take it out of the social realm as much as possible, so it's an online task and they're physical objects that they're familiar with, and there is a lot of agreement about what they're called across people. It's not like they're dialect differences. And we didn't attach it to any person. So I hate to make predictions about fields that I know almost nothing about, but I wonder if the issues in social cognition aren't related to the issues in categorization, because people are complicated and hard to categorize. So if you have trouble generalizing, one cap to the next cap, maybe you have trouble generalizing from one person to the next person. But I don't know. Yeah. Yes.
Another question. I'm thinking about the example you gave about grammatical learning, and in the typical developmental literature report, her colleagues reported that children are more likely to overgeneralize than adults, and generalizing the statistical information they have experienced in the inputs to categories that don't strictly exist.
Yeah, I think there's a different interpretation to that finding.
Okay.
So kids do overgeneralize in their production,
Right.
but they do in word meaning too. So there's a classic, how young kids will often call any animal a dog, right? Or any round thing a ball. But if you ask them, show me the dog, and now you're showing them a dog and a cow, they're reliably correct. And that tells me, and we've actually done an experiment with Jesse Schwab and Casey Lou Williams. We've done an experiment comparing kids' production and comprehension on that kind of novel grammar, like the novel construction learning task that I suggested. So what happens is they do regularize in their production. I think they're perseverating. They use one, they stick to it. But in their comprehension, they know that they've heard two different cases. And they have trouble keeping them straight, but their comprehension knowledge is better than their production knowledge. So I don't think that kids overgeneralize. I think kids stay very close to what they've heard, except that they're in new situations and new contexts, and they have to use the language that they have, and so it looks like overgeneralization. Yeah. I think that's even why kids learn language more accurately, if it's okay to say accurately, than adult learners, because they do absorb those statistics without trying to generalize, because they don't know the basis for the generalization early on. Yes?
So kind of follow up on this question. In autistic individuals who are fully verbal but have social difficulties, could some of those social difficulties be more subtle, like difficulties with more subtle generalizations of language, like generalizations of forms that sarcasm can take?
Yeah, we know that's exactly right. Like verbal autistic adults are said to have more trouble with sarcasm and irony.
An
And
extension of this?
it could be. Yeah, because the cues to that, the intonation patterns or the facial looks to indicate sarcasm are really variable. They really depend on context. So it's very possible. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but because the other possibility is that they don't understand what the other person is thinking, right? Which would make it more social, and that's possible too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question, but it's slightly off topic. So it's related only to the first part of your talk. I hope that's okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, and I wanted to say thank you so much for the talk.
Oh, thank you.
It was great. So for homonymy versus polysemy, so you said polysemy is when the two meanings are related and homonymy is when they're not. Is there a reliable way in general to identify? No. Okay.
No. So there's a Klein and there are individual differences, right? So, yeah. Right. So some things are very close and some things are very distant. Yeah. No, and some people think that things are related when they're historically not, and vice versa. Yeah. So it's definitely a Klein of similarity.
But
Yeah.
if they're historically, like, evolutionary related, you classify them as polysemy?
No. I only use it when people judge them to be similar or when they are used in multiple other languages. So there's a classic definition of polysemy that I like, which is polysemy is recurrent homonymy across languages. So if multiple languages do it, it's not an accident.
Thank you, I love that.
Yeah.
I have to ask a
Okay.
question that's been burning up for me. Do we know anything about the usage of the kinds of grammatical construction-based meaning correlates that you talked about, like the double object construction or the gossip construction in individuals with autism?
Yeah, we're going there.
Oh, great.
We're going there. Yeah, we haven't done that yet. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I have a sort of even much more intimate question. I love your examples of those constructions and the gossip construction and this amazing distinction between you're big to be here, which might mean literally too big, versus big of you to be here, which is this very non-moving. It's amazing how different those are. And what is it that makes the word adjust rather than the construction?
Very good question. That's generally right, that the construction wins if there's a conflict. So if I say, another simple example is like, I'll have a wine. And wine is usually a mass noun, and we wouldn't use a with it, but if you do, you mean a glass of wine. The construction wins. I think it's because the constructions emerge from generalizing over a lot of words. And so they tend to be more fixed. They're more frequent, they're more entrenched. And the words slip around. The words are used in multiple contexts. So they're the ones to bend. That's a speculation. The brute force thing is, you're right, that the construction wins. But, yeah. Why? Yeah. I would say it's because the construction's more entrenched.
All right, let's thank our speaker again.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
What kind of project?
If they were, if someone, so maybe if it's more about what they might just stick to what they won't do it. But if they feel like this is about other people, then maybe. But also, I was also thinking about, like, even if that still exists as something that I still
Oh, no, I can't.
I cannot imagine, I cannot reason about other people's minds, or I have trouble reasoning about what you are thinking about that. Therefore, I have
Similar to like follow what people's like.
because I agree with that.